today we're going to go over the basic hardware components of a Sisu Cinema robot. Okay, so first of all, we're going to jump into the robot itself and talk about some of the different axes of the robot. So first of all, your camera and your camera mounting plates, they mount to the flange of axis 6 of the robot. Axis 6 being the axis at the end of the robot, which rotates out here. Now, next we have axis 5, which is sometimes called the wrist of the robot. Axis 5 is what pivots the camera back and forth like this. Axis 5, after that comes axis 4. Axis 4 is what rotates the camera, or I should say it rotates the wrist around like this. So axis 4, 5, and 6, those four kind of make up your wrist of the robot, which allow you to do a lot of the pan, tilt, roll motion. Now, the next axis, axis 3, is this big one way up here. Axis 3, and then down here we have axis 2. Both of those rotate around similar axes, but just in different locations. Then axis 2 sits on top of axis 1, which rotates the whole base of the robot around to move the robot where it needs to go. Okay, so now let's talk about the connections to the robot. So on the back of the robot, you have a number of connections. The biggest two are the main robot power, this big guy right here, and then the robot data cable. So obviously those are the most important things to get connected to the robot in order to control it. Then we have this yellow and green cable, which connects on the side here to a grounding nut. And that's your ground cable, very important so that the robot stays electrically safe. Then from there, we have another robot cable, which is your mastering sensor over here. And so when it's plugged in correctly, you'll get two lights on the back of this mastering sensor right here. And when you run mastering, you'll note that as the cheese plate comes up next to the mastering switch, these lights will go off, and that means everything's working properly. Lastly, we have the camera cables that are routed up through the bottom of the robot here. So you have your fizz cable and then an SDI cable, which get mounted to the combo cable adapter plate here. Okay, so let's talk about some of the components on the base of the robot. So first of all, to get your weights on and off, we need to take these shrouds off. So we'll unlatch these shroud latches, and then we'll pull the shroud off, straight off this way, set it to the side. Now we would take off both shrouds, and that would allow us to load the plates onto the robot here. And then once you get the plates on the robot base, then we're going to level our feet right here. So there's 4 feet here. Use the provided wrench to torque down your feet so that they're nice and level. And then you're going to, once the robot is nice and level, you're going to tighten down these jam nut screws so that these feet are nice and solid and that there's no shake there. This cable right here and this cable are the cables we showed before, and those go back to the robot controller and the Sisu interface module that we'll show next. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the components on our robot controller. So first of all, there's your big cabinet here for your bigger robots like a C20 or C31. This is the KRC4. On the smaller robots like a C14, that comes in a smaller cabinet, and it's a different KRC4. It's called the KRC4 Compact. But essentially it's the same thing. This is the robot brains of the system. This is what controls all the different servo motors on the robot itself, okay? But to make things easy for you to interface with the KRC4, we have this nice, lovely interface module. We call it the Sisu interface module, or just SIM for short. So I want to walk through some of the components on the SIM that you should be familiar with so that you know how to work your robot. So going over here to the front panel, first of all, the e-stop, you can push it any time, no matter where the robot is. It will not hurt the robot, so don't be afraid to push it if you need to. If you do push the e-stop, the reset button will start to flash, and that means you can't move your robot until you clear that reset button. So what I need to do is unlock any of my e-stops, and then I should be able to clear my reset. Next, we have the key switch. The key switch has 3 states, T1, T2, and auto. You'll generally use T1 and T2 We haven't implemented auto yet, but that is something to come. Next, we have this cable. This cable is the connection to the SRC case. So this powers your case and sends data back and forth with your tablet and wand. It's important to note that this powers your case. So you should always do a software shutdown on the case before you unplug this or before you unplug power to the SIM. The cable here is the fizz cable. So this is connecting to your fizz motors, to the camera power, and loop light connection out on your combo cable on the robot. This is where you plug it in for your standard robots. If you have a robot on a track, then we have a different connector and cable that go into these two connections right here for fizz and track and other related external axes. The other thing that I want to mention is that there are a number of connectors here that go to your robot. So you have a couple of Ethernet cables. These are important to be plugged into the right place. They are labeled here, and so you should be able to know which connection goes where if you ever get confused. This is our connector to the robot for a bunch of digital I/O and other connections that are important for the robot to run properly. Over here is where you have your user I/O interface. So we have our digital inputs, our digital outputs, and our safety I/O. Okay, so safety I/O is if you want to plug in like an external e-stop or something, you can take off one of these loop backs and plug in the safety I/O. But you'll typically be using these inputs and outputs. So the inputs, if you wanted to have a software trigger, you want to tell the robot to start the program from some other device. You would wire in an input here, and these you just pull out and you can wire in the device through these push pins right there. Same thing with the outputs. On the inputs you have 24 volts on top, and then you have your inputs on the bottom. On the outputs you have your outputs on top, and then your ground on the bottom. So make sure you know what you're doing when you're messing with these. It is 24 volt power, and so you need to have 24 volt compatible devices as you're using it. If you do ever plug something wrong in, we do have breakers here for your GPIO, which are these connections right here. GPIO is general purpose inputs, outputs. There's also breakers here for your fizz motors and for the camera power as well. So if you ever see power being dropped, you can come over here and check to see if that breaker needs to be flipped back over. We do have some other connections here that can be useful for support or debug. So for example, there's a USB cable that connects into the SIM computer that's in here, display port to see what's going on there, as well as some DMX in and out, which is where you would plug in your DMX connector there. Great, so that completes our overview of the Sisu Cinema robot hardware.